I'm Tyler Chrestman. Welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. So as I'm sure most of you who will be watching at least this inaugural episode of the podcast, Chrestman Conversation, will know I have been writing for a few years now about politics, cultural issues, all these different things that interest me just for fun. I do not report news. I'm not a journalist. I just have opinions about things that I find interesting. And a lot of people tend to enjoy it. A lot of people tend to not enjoy it. I don't think of myself as very controversial in terms of what I say is not often meant to be inflammatory or provocative. However, I feel as though a lot of people disagree with me on a lot of topics, which I love. I love talking to people who do not share my opinions. The problem is, over the course of the last 6 months to a year, I've been working on some other projects. I haven't been updating my blog very often, haven't been publishing things online very much at all. And because of that, I've kind of missed the engagement I've had with people on all these issues that are going on in the news. So I decided to start a podcast because anyone who knows me personally will more than attest to, I am never at a lack for words. We can talk and talk and talk, which is great, I suppose, sometimes. Sometimes it drives people nuts. But the goal of the podcast is not to do a recap of news. That is not entertaining whatsoever. If you want the news, watch the news. If you want to, read the paper. The headlines will tell you what you need to know. There's plenty of things out there that give updates as to what's going on in the world. That's not the goal of this. The goal of this will be to take subjects that are in the news, so things that are in the headlines, and try and either talk about broader issues or just something that really interested me this week, or perhaps anyone out there who wants to write in about a topic. That would be great as well. So this podcast will go up on YouTube as well. We're going to include some video. I am not incredibly technically savvy. So there's going to be a lot of playing around, especially in these first few episodes, trying to get some title graphics, theme music, all these different things that people do to make themselves look more professional. I'm not great at any of that stuff, so I'm going to figure it out. But the first couple episodes, bear with me as I'm working on it. Like I said, the goal is just short, digestible bits, sort of hot takes on whatever's going on the week. It's completely unscripted. I don't have anything in front of me. Just going to talk about, whatever's on my mind. I did have a topic coming into today that I want to discuss. The first one being something that has really bothered me this past week. Anyone who happens to live in the United States, and I'm sure other people around the world as well, might be aware that there were 2 mass shootings this week. One in El Paso, one in Dayton. And unfortunately, these have dominated the news cycle. It's not unfortunate that they're in the news cycle, it's just unfortunate that they occurred whatsoever. And these are terrible. There's a lot of different topics to discuss when it comes to this. You could talk about gun control. You could talk about mental health. Talk about sort of political rhetoric and what it's doing to our country and the divide that appears to happen between people. A lot of different ways that people tend to be talking past each other in this argument about gun control specifically. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can go about addressing this. The thing that I want to talk about that I find disturbing, and it was getting some coverage this week a little bit, but it not obviously the most prominent or pressing thing that needed to be discussed, but it does need to be discussed, is there is an unfortunate section of people who happen to be on the left that have used the El Paso shooter as a way to castigate anyone who happens to be slightly to the right of them as sympathetic towards racism and xenophobia. And it's a really cynical and ugly move that I really, really detest. And the unfortunate fact is that a lot of people don't notice it because it's very subtle. It's not like everyone's coming out there and saying all conservatives support killing Mexican immigrants at Walmart. That's not what people are saying. But the unfortunate thing is that for example, I did pull up an article here immediately prior to starting this episode because I was trying to remember what the title of it was from the New York Times earlier this week. I love the New York Times. It's great. I don't agree with some of the stuff that they write, but what a fantastic newspaper. It just doing great work. And you get a lot of your news from there, even if you disagree with them. They do very factual reporting on a lot of things. One of the issues I've always taken with people is when they call New York Times or CNN and things like this fake news is this idea that they're not fake. They're biased, but they're not fake. And there's a difference. I think people should own their bias. The New York Times or CNN. CNN wants to pretend to be objectively up the middle. They're not. And that's why you say, like, well, just own it. Just then, lay your cards on the table and no one cares. But it's not fake. But this article in the New York Times, it upsets me because it is this idea that any political language is now being called incitement. So the title of the article, and forgive me, I'm actually going to look right now because I forgot who wrote it. But it was called "The El Paso Shooting Suspects Manifesto Echoed Trump's Language." It's by Peter Baker and Michael Shear. Now, when you're reading this article, it is really, really unfortunate, the argument that they're trying to make. As people know, I'm more than happy to tell you, I did not vote for Donald Trump. I am not a Donald Trump fan. I don't like him personally. That being said, even if I agree with some of his policies, which I do, I don't think he is the best choice for the leader of the United States. Now, that being said, what bothers me is when people disingenuously attribute things to him that are untrue. So there's been this move that basically said Donald Trump is tough on immigration. Now, he has dipped, and I will criticize him as hard as anyone. When he dips into xenophobic or bigoted language, it is not okay. It's not good. But what Donald Trump is not is a white supremacist. He's not a white supremacist. That's not true. It's not a true thing. I do not believe that he is secretly wants to make an Aryan nation. That is not accurate. Donald Trump is tough on immigration. I don't know if it's necessarily because he understands economics or because he has some xenophobic underpinnings. However, as someone who leans to the right on this issue, it bothers me tremendously when they say that because he holds views that are tough on immigration, therefore he supports these racist views that this person has who is obviously insane. Obviously, we're not going to, and just an important side note, we're not going to discuss the name of the shooter. We're not going to do that. There's some good evidence that says you shouldn't talk about the names of people who commit mass shootings because a lot of them are driven by fame seeking. They want to be famous. Don't make them famous. So we're not going to discuss his name, just to say he's a low-life piece of crap who deserves life in jail and a very uncomfortable existence. But we're not going to discuss his name. But anyway, the point is that I hold views that are very tough on immigration. I think our immigration system needs a tremendous reform, and we should definitely be tough on the southern border. Those are my personal views. None of that, absolutely none of that, is because I have any sort of xenophobic tendencies or because I'm bigoted against brown people. And it is really unfortunate that there is a large section of the country that would like to say that. Because I'm tough on immigration, therefore they take the El Paso shooter and say, well, if you speak strongly against immigration, and he echoes some of that in his manifesto, therefore you're lending cover to bigoted ideology and white supremacy. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake to make for a lot of reasons. Specifically because it's a game that can go both ways. If there are 300 million people in the country, and half of them are on the right, half of them are on the left, more or less. If I speak strongly about an issue, and one person in that 300 million acts like a lunatic, well, chances are that person's just a lunatic. And I didn't incite them to do anything. I think incitement is a very clear standard that we have to protect, because what we don't want is any sort of heated debate where one crazy person from the fringe goes off and does some terrible, terrible deed. We don't want them to go back to you and say, well, you incited it. The problem is that this goes both ways, and the unfortunate fact is that because it goes both ways, but it isn't only talked about on one side. Every time someone on the right, for example, does something terrible, the entire right is then asked, well, do you disown this? Do you disown this thing? And you say, yeah, of course. I don't support white supremacy. It is a garbage ideology, and people who practice it are terrible human beings. I can say that 1,000 times. The overwhelming majority of the people said that. Donald Trump said that. He came out and said white supremacy needs to be fought in all areas, and we need to crush out this ideology, right? He said it. And people then say, well, but he didn't mean it. Okay. Well, I don't pretend to know his mind. I just, what do you want him to say that would make you believe him? Is it the fact that in order to believe him, does he have to adopt your policy? Well, because I don't adopt your policy, and I obviously don't support shooting anyone. So, anyway, the point being, the problem with this argument that political speech is violence, or that it's incitement and you're basically dog whistling to people to go commit violence on your behalf, is that it has happened on both sides, and we don't play the same game. So, for example, does anyone remember a couple years ago when a congressional baseball game was shot up and Republican Steve Scalise was shot and almost died? That was in the news for like 2 days. And you say, well, okay, we didn't have this giant thing. A lot of people didn't die, so it wasn't a giant mass shooting, but it was a huge deal. It was a political baseball game that this guy shot up. And the problem is that he was a very progressive leftist, Bernie Sanders supporter. And you say, okay, well, Bernie, he doesn't use that kind of language, but he does. Like, they do. It's very heated. You remember when Democrats were talking about Republicans wanted to kill millions of Americans by taking away their health care? As if that's not rhetoric that could be insightful. Like, if you think that Republicans want to murder millions of people, is that not incitement? No, I don't think so. But the standard, if we're going to hold people to a standard, then if that's the standard, okay. So Donald Trump incites someone because he says, well, he says terrible things. He's a terrible example because he says, things like Mexicans are invading, which is not a good thing to say. I don't like that term, but if I was to say immigration's a problem, it's a real problem, and we should be tough on the southern border, that's not incitement. I don't think many people would say that. The problem is that in politics, that also is boring. So people tend to be more, they take their rhetoric up a notch. Or how about a month ago, 2 months ago at this point, there was an ICE facility attacked on the border. ICE agents were hurt. People were throwing firebombs at the ICE agent. No one said, hey, AOC, all you guys who are saying ICE is basically the Gestapo and all this stuff, will you condemn Antifa? When they were asked this question, they just walk past people as if they're that language, that ICE is the Gestapo and we have concentration camps on the border. That's not inciting people to violence against the ICE facility. That happened in real life. And we didn't have New York Times articles asking why AOC is inciting violence. And so my point is that I don't like when the game is one-sided. And it really does seem to be one-sided recently against people on the right in a way that I find unfair. Again, I tend to hold views that are similar in policy, not in rhetoric, not in any underlying reasoning, I don't think. But in terms of policy, I tend to support a lot of the Republican administration's policy on immigration. Be tough on the southern border, yes. Do we need mass deportations? Probably not. There's a path to citizenship is probably the best bet for people in the country. However, should we be tough? Should we police our southern border? Absolutely, to the fullest extent. Now again, absolutely no bigotry or xenophobia in that statement. There's a lot of reasoning behind it, but this isn't about immigration. This is about rhetoric, so we're not going to discuss that necessarily this time. Anyway, this first episode is basically an abridged version. I want to talk about a policy every week for an extended period of time, 15, 20 minutes. However, this first one is a little chopped up because this is going to have to be sort of a pilot episode, right? This is basically me testing it out, trying to see how it goes. Overall, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that words are not violence. They're not. And incitement is a very specific thing that we should all guard against. Right? Incitement is already a crime. You're not allowed to incite people to violence. So let's just say that unless someone calls for violence against someone, they're not inciting violence. That is a good standard to hold people to. Because I'm all for more speech, not less speech. And if your political rhetoric is charged, if it's very heated, I'm okay with that. Okay, they get worked up. Yeah, these are issues that that are important to people. I understand that entirely. But don't then accuse other people of inciting violence if they're not. Donald Trump is not inciting violence when he says we have a problem on our southern border. He's not condoning racism when he says that. So it bothers me when people act as though he is, because I really dislike that as just in general, just in terms of the underpinnings of why that's not a good thing. It just isn't. It's not a good thing for our political discourse when we start telling people that the words that they're saying and the way that they discuss issues are causing violence. It's a way of shutting down debate, and I don't like that. I don't like that at all. I don't think anyone should. I think it's an ugly thing to do. But anyway, so like I said, this is going to be an abridged version. Normally, I would want to talk about this later. The way I would like to structure this in the future is I'm going to talk about an issue for 15 to 20 minutes. And then what I'd really enjoy doing is taking questions from people at the end, just doing like a Q&A right at the end, where I'll answer any questions that someone wants to send my way, which I think would be nice. So we're going to try and work on that. Anyone who wants to email me a question, that's definitely the best way to do it. I might... for the first little bit, I don't know. We'll see. For the first little bit, I might also take questions off of like YouTube comments. However, emailing me would be the best bet because YouTube comments tend to be terrible. Just as a general rule of thumb, especially anything political. If you go down in the YouTube comments, if you try and dive down into that deep dark hole, that is a place you don't want to be. It is garbage down there. So anyway, emailing me would be the best bet. I would really love to answer questions at the end of these whenever we get the opportunity. So I don't know. Let's make that happen. Let's try and make that happen. It'd be great. So in the interim, like I said, the important takeaway from this episode is why I started it, and that speech is not violent. And if you believe that words are the equivalent to physical violence, I would encourage you to read a book about anything that you disagree with. Because if you can make it through the book without being physically shaken to the core, then you'll realize, hey, wait, this is not violence. That's not true. Words can't actually hurt you. There used to be a saying about this. Sticks and stones, something along those lines. Sticks and stones. And I feel as though people forgot. They now think that words are like getting a punch in the face. And I mean, that is just coming from a generation that has never had to deal with adversity. If you think that words can hurt you, you have had a very easy life. I'm just going to say that. So anyway, let's all try and calm down on the malicious attacks on people on the other side. Don't attribute... There's a phrase that I absolutely love that I found a little bit transformative in the way that you can view life. I may be doing a bad paraphrase, but it's something along the lines of never attribute malice to something that can be explained by incompetence. So if you think that another person is acting evilly, maybe they just don't know better. Maybe they just disagree with you. And maybe they actually don't have malice in their heart or bad intentions. If we all just extend that to each other a little bit, it'd be great. But anyway, like I said, this first episode is basically a pilot. I'm playing around with it, so forgive me, guys. I'm going to get on my editing game. I'm going to get on my title graphics and all the good stuff, all that good stuff. So just bear with me a little bit, and please email me some questions. The email tcchrestman@gmail.com. Just type in the subject questions, and then whatever you want to say, or if you, feedback, comments, anything, feel free to email me. I check my email religiously. I keep that inbox spick and span, so I will read it, absolutely. Just email me anything out on your mind, and we'll figure it out. Hopefully we can talk about it. And like I said, I'm going to try. My aim is going to be to do one a week, maybe more, depending on how these are received and honestly just how I'm feeling. So I can tend to keep it pretty laid back. So anyway, thank you for joining me. Like I said, this is going to go up on YouTube. It's going to go on Apple Podcasts. I'll probably put an audio version downloadable on the website as well. We'll see. I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to play around with the sourcing of that a little bit, I guess. Like I said, I'm not very tech savvy, so we'll figure it out. Anyway, I'm Tyler Chrestman. Thank you for joining me. This is Chrestman Conversation. You guys have a good week.